Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Subcontinent. Our program aims to address the most significant issues in the South Asian region that affect the governments, communities, organizations and the region as a whole. We will try to explore and explain its geopolitics, untangle the arguments from different perspectives and make the alternative voices heard. So stay tuned.
In this edition of the Subcontinent, we are going to take a look at the rapidly deteriorating security situation in Afghanistan in the aftermath of the exit of foreign forces and resurgence of Daesh. And we shall discuss how the US and its allies contributed to the growth of terrorism, in particular the Daesh terrorist group in war-ravaged Afghanistan.
Afghanistan has been rocked by a series of terrorist attacks in recent weeks, from Nangarhar in the east, Kunduz in the north, to Kandahar in the south and the capital Kabul. The ghastly bombings were claimed by the Daesh terrorist group in its new, more dangerous incarnation, made possible by the botched US exit. The aim, experts say, is to undermine the newly established rule of its arch-enemy, Taliban, and to stir sectarian tensions and civil war in the country by targeting the vulnerable minorities.
The disastrous end of the US military occupation of Afghanistan 2 months ago also marked the resurgence of a terrorist group that has long shared love-hate relationship with the West. Amidst the chaotic withdrawal of US forces, Daesh suicide bombers detonated their explosives outside the Kabul airport on August 26th, killing over 170 Afghans. 13 American troops were killed as well, that prompted the US to launch a drone strike on August 29th, mowing down 10 more poor Afghan civilians. In the weeks after the last remaining US troops left the country, Daesh terrorists carried out several low-intensity attacks in its stronghold of Nangarhar, mainly targeting overground Taliban fighters. In early October, the group went back to its favored mode of urban warfare suicide bombings. The sprawling Eidgah Mosque in Kabul was targeted on October 3rd, killing 7 civilians, but the worst was yet to come. On October 8th, a deadly bombing ripped through a mosque in northern Kunduz province during Friday prayers, leaving over 150 dead, all members of ethnic Hazara Shia community. A week later, another mosque was bombed in southern Kandahar province, which claimed over 60 lives. Victims in both incidents were buried in mass graves and, like always, reduced to cold statistics in the Western media.
شهید داده رسیم. هفته پیش بچه برادر خود در قندوز شهید دادم. در این هفته در روز جمعه در سر نماز که نه بر فایده رفته بودیم نه بر کار رفته بودیم، بر عبادت خدا رفتیم. برادر مرا شهید کرده، نواسه برادرم زخمی شده، عمویم زخمی است، دیگه برادرم زخمی است. تا بخیر به خاطر خدا.
The spate of bombings in recent weeks in Afghanistan serves two key purposes for the Daesh terrorist group: undermining the newly established Taliban rule and stoking the flames of sectarian and ethnic tensions in the country known for its rich diversity. Daesh, which first made inroads into the Hindu Kush country in late 2014, has fought pitched battles with the Taliban in eastern Afghanistan without much luck. At the same time, it has played the sectarian card by targeting the Hazara Shia community, as was evident in recent weeks.
The long-running rivalry between the Taliban and Daesh has entered a new and deadlier phase following the unceremonious ouster of the US-led foreign forces from Afghanistan. The two groups, with competing strategic interests, have since 2014 waged war on each other through the rugged terrain of eastern Afghanistan. While Daesh has sought to use Afghanistan as a platform to regroup and rebuild its forces after facing crushing defeats in Iraq and Syria, Taliban has been fighting to throw out US-led foreign forces from Afghanistan in order to rebuild the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. Having succeeded in its 20-year armed struggle, Taliban now faces another foreign enemy that seeks to undermine its rule at a time when Afghanistan is staring at a worst humanitarian crisis. At the same time, targeting members of a particular ethnic and religious community serves another important purpose for Daesh, creating sectarian and ethnic discord in the country. For years, the US-backed governments were accused of failing to protect vulnerable ethnic minorities from terrorist groups like Daesh. Now, the buck stops at Taliban. It is important to note that ethnic divisions and civil war has historically benefited foreign powers and their proxies in Afghanistan. So, Daesh may very well be batting here for the neo-imperial powers.
The uprising of Daesh-K, or Daesh Khorasan as they call it, became very, very prominent when Donald Trump was in power. And why did it become prominent? Because they're being funded, in part by Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is basically pulling the strings on this. And when that happens, you can expect this kind of these kinds of attacks.
The narrative that the US military-industrial complex has contributed to the growth of terrorism in Afghanistan, and in particular the Daesh terrorist group, has been gaining ground for quite some time now. The fact that the US-led coalition, despite the staggering $2 trillion investment and the most advanced weaponry and intelligence, failed to eliminate terrorist groups like Daesh in Afghanistan, lends credence to the theory that the group essentially serves America's objectives in the wider region.
Taliban officials have unequivocally blamed the US for Daesh terrorist group's resurgence, which has led to some deadly terrorist attacks in the early days of the newly announced Islamic Emirate. Ahmad Yasser, an official at Taliban's political bureau in Doha, was quoted as saying that there is evidence to suggest that recent attacks on Shia mosques in Afghanistan had malicious foreign hand behind them. Qari Saeed Khosti, who handles social media for Taliban, also held Americans responsible for recent Daesh bombings. He refused cooperation with the US in fighting Daesh, saying the group had made comeback with the help of the US and the former Afghan government. Hezbollah leader Sayed Hassan Nasrallah, in a speech last week, also stressed that the US must take responsibility for Daesh presence in Afghanistan, accusing Americans of shipping Daesh terrorists from Syria to Afghanistan.
الأمريكان نحن عندنا معلومات وغيرنا عنده معلومات إنه الأمريكان عم ينقلوا داعش من شرق الفرات ومن مخيم الهول وحتى نقلوا بعضهم من العراق إلى أفغانستان.
This claim has been often repeated by credible military sources and cannot be dismissed.
Saudi Arabia has been shipping criminals and terrorists out to Afghanistan because that was the only safe haven for them. And that has been going on for years now. It's not something that the United States intelligence wouldn't have known this. But I think they probably let it happen because the amount of armaments that Saudi Arabia was buying from the United States was taking more precedence than, basically, curbing world terrorism. Because if they're far away, if they're that far away, and they're in the mountains, chances are that they're not going to attack the United States, and basically that's pretty much how it played out. And we're seeing the end result of it today, though, which is this is going to be an absolute lawless playground for terrorists.
There are also reports that Taliban's interim government has been unable to locate the previous government's security files, which include critical information on Daesh. The files allegedly were discarded by the US forces fleeing the country in utter haste. In the absence of the US-led coalition, the mission to keep the pot boiling in Afghanistan has been taken up by Daesh.
When the Taliban militants in 2001 offered to lay down their arms and surrender, then US President George W. Bush dismissed the offer and ordered carpet bombings that left a trail of death and destruction. In contrast, when the more dangerous terrorist group like Daesh was regrouping its forces in early 2020, bringing in new recruits from Central Asia, North Caucasus, and China's Xinjiang region, Americans paid little attention. This not only shows double standards, but also their shared interest in Afghanistan and the region.
In the months before the US-led coalition forces beat the humiliating retreat from Afghanistan, ending the 20-year disastrous military campaign, some 8,000 to 10,000 terrorists made their way to Afghanistan from Central Asia, North Caucasus, Pakistan and China's Xinjiang region, according to a United Nations report released in June. Most of them were recruited by Daesh, which was evident from the Kunduz mosque bombing that was carried out by an ethnic Uyghur. Americans and their allies were still in Afghanistan, engaged in so-called counter-terrorism operations, when these foreign terrorists quietly slipped into the country under the nose of US and NATO forces. Interestingly, the top American military commander Mark Milley also sounded alarm bells recently, saying there was probability of a broader civil war, reconstitution of al-Qaeda and growth of Daesh.
In the fall of 2020, my analysis then was that an accelerated withdrawal without meeting specific and necessary conditions risks losing the substantial gains made in Afghanistan, would potentially damage U.S. worldwide credibility, and could precipitate a general collapse of the Afghan security forces and the Afghan government, resulting in a complete Taliban takeover or general civil war.
The intelligence was robust, but the political will to tackle the emerging threat was missing. Having been overthrown by a ragtag group of Kalashnikov-yielding fighters, Americans saw Daesh as a possible proxy to continue its mission in the war-ravaged country. The move to freeze around $10 billion Afghan assets, experts say, is designed to making Taliban's job of governance difficult, and the presence of Daesh makes the job even more difficult. So, it's anybody's guess who is the winner here.
Now, to have more insights, we are joined by Carol Verreken, member of the Afghanistan Task Force at the German-based political and economic think tank Schiller Institute. Mr. Verreken, first of all, welcome to the program. Now, we have recently witnessed Afghanistan has been rocked by a series of bombings in recent weeks, which was claimed by the Daesh terrorist group. Now, do you think the ground for this bloodshed was set by America's botched exit from the country?
Thank you for having me on this program. I think indeed, well, it's very hard to say, but there is a major tectonic shifts in so-called geopolitics going on in this region, especially because the Western financial system is bankrupt, and on the other side, China, Iran, and Russia are increasingly cooperating on the Belt and Road program to rebuild the world infrastructures. Pakistan is not going anymore to Washington to get dollars, but is trying to integrate the Eurasian reconstruction program. So the US left, the military left, but in a sense, I think there is a policy of scorched earth, that there are some people in the military Anglo-American system which they will poison the well. They want to burn the earth. They don't want Afghanistan to succeed in being reconstructed or representing anything. So there is a policy of chaos which we have to denounce and present an alternative.
And now, Mr. Varakan, the two deadly attacks in 2 consecutive weeks targeting the minority Shia community seems to be a plot to create sectarian discord in the country. So who do you think benefits from all this?
Yes, this is the second bombing in a row where the Shiite mosques are being targeted. Now, the entire challenge which the new Afghan government wants to take up is to build a national unity around a reconciliation program of national construction, of national rebuilding, everything which has been destroyed over the last 20 years. So there is, in my sense, definitely an intention of certain terrorist groups operating. These are networks which don't control territory, which is the good news. What they want to do is to create insecurity, to make Afghanistan a place where nobody can go and cooperate, and also discredit the new interior minister, Sirajuddin Haqqani, who was a man who is a very old founder of the Taliban and who knows a lot of secrets of American and English, British intelligence services in the manipulation of terrorism. So they want to discredit him by creating a complete insecurity and demonstrate that the Taliban are not able, and especially the Haqqani networks, that they cannot guarantee security to their own population.
Now, as we have witnessed the Daesh terrorist group, since making inroads into Afghanistan in 2014, has carried out some of the most ghastly attacks in the country. So why did the US-led coalition dismiss the threat all these years?
Well, the whole thing, the so-called liberation and reconstruction of Afghanistan since 2001 was a complete bad joke and a huge enterprise of mutual corruption. According to some figures of people which work in the so-called aid programs, the assistance of all the money which was given for aid to Afghanistan, close to 70% went into corruption and never was ever used for underground networks. So that it went to fake army units. Now we know, for example, that the son of the former defense minister bought a resort in Beverly Hills of $20 million. So this enormous amount of money, which was not going to the Afghan people or to the reconstruction, it was going to the US military and to all the people, also the private military companies like Blackwater and others, which were paid.
And now let's take a break from the questions and take a look at how the global media has covered this issue.
The US administration deliberately came up with an obscure concept of international terrorism, and this concept was used as a justification for the occupation of Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya and Syria. Over the last 20 years, we have understood that this amorphous structure called international terrorism is associated with organizations that the US has facilitated by exploiting and revitalizing ethnic and religious tensions in order to justify its imperialist aggression. Even former US President Donald Trump admitted on August 11, 2016, that Obama founded ISIS, and I would say the co-founder would be crooked Hillary Clinton. The ISIS needed Afghanistan's chaos. It has not regrouped since the death of its leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in 2019, and the loss of its territorial caliphate in Syria and Iraq. Al-Qaeda also has been a shell of its former self, even long before US troops killed Osama bin Laden. In fact, terrorist attacks worldwide in 2020 markedly decreased, and in Afghanistan, ISIS-K was competing directly with Al-Qaeda for dwindling fighters and funding there, amid thousands of US and NATO troops. The Taliban's victory provides air to jihadists who have been suffocating, strangled by the world's counter-terrorism initiatives. But which organizations will most benefit? The abuses and excesses of war, from torture to remote control killing by drone, have cost the United States moral authority around the world. Its occupying army spawned a new generation of Qaeda franchises, while the black-clad fighters of the ISIS swarmed into the vacuum left by departing American troops in Iraq, and the financial drain from a sprawling counter-terrorism campaign has been vast, fueling the military's budgets even years after major combat in Afghanistan and Iraq ended.
Mr. Varaken, now do you think the sudden resurgence of Daesh in Afghanistan, including the traditional Taliban stronghold Kandahar, could be designed to undermine the newly established Taliban government?
Yes, it does, because Kandahar is a strong place for the Taliban, and that if they cannot guarantee security there, it's symbolic. It's a symbolic act which is very strong. So it's what we discussed before. There is a fight I think there really is. Some people are. We don't know the details because it's very complicated, but there is clearly an effort to try. An attempt to discredit the Afghan government and to keep it, to bring it down on the ground.
So how do you see the role of regional countries in preventing terrorist groups from regaining foothold in Afghanistan, and also to deny Western countries an excuse to invade and occupy the country again?
I think the neighboring countries have a much better view than the United States or Europe, because they think they all have a sense of their mutual interest. The countries around, especially China, Russia, and Iran, they have a sense of mutual development based on also the energy resources. For example, the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline. There are major projects. There's also a lot of mineral resources in Afghanistan, especially copper, iron, but also lithium and rare earths. So there is a different view to build peace through development. You cannot have peace only by signing pieces of paper and declarations. You need to change the concrete living conditions of these populations, and this is in the common interest. We, with the Schiller Institute, we're trying to wake up the West and to change its mind and support this positive dynamic.
On that note, I would like to thank Mr. Varaken for his precious time, knowledge and insight. Now, let's see how people have reacted on social media and cyberspace on the recent bombings in Afghanistan.
Robert Morton, author and former US intelligence officer, quotes the top American spy saying that Afghanistan no longer remains their top concern for international terrorism. Political commentator and poet Masoud Mortazavi asserts that freezing of Afghan funds by the US is creating a stream of poverty-stricken recruits from Daesh. Awais Sattar, defense analyst and columnist, accuses the US and Israeli regime of disrupting peace and fomenting terrorism in Afghanistan by supporting Daesh. Researcher and analyst Abdul Sayed refers to statements made by senior Taliban leaders calling Daesh a conspiracy of Americans and some neighboring states. Muska Dastagir, a university lecturer and commentator, says if Afghanistan continues to lose more generations to illiteracy and ignorance, the idea of Afghanistan will be lost too.
And that was our episode about the rapidly deteriorating security situation in Afghanistan and how the US and its allies have contributed to the growth of terrorist groups like Daesh. Now, to watch the best bits and pieces of our show and more subcontinental updates, follow us on social media platforms and don't forget to give us your feedback. We shall meet again, same time, same day next week. So till then, take care.